Hello, business innovators and educators. You're listening to The Enterprise Learning Architect. I'm your host, Chris Knotts, here to guide you through practices and ideas you can use to help build a culture of learning in your organization. Stay tuned to power up your professional playbook as we have conversations with exceptional people who share their experience in achieving successful learning outcomes. Ready to innovate, educate, and iterate? Let's do it. Hi, and welcome back to the Enterprise Learning Pod. We're back after a lovely summer vacation, and it's time to get back to business. Today, we again talk with the very talented enterprise agility coach, Clinton Aegis, but he'll turn the tables and put me in the hot seat, as he asks me the questions this time. As a pioneer in enterprise learning and a maestro of transformation strategy, Clinton pushes me on questions about steering organizational change and using professional learning as a way to successfully drive it. We draw from our experience integrating emergent technologies and fostering cultures that embrace adaptive, outcome-driven business goals, always through the lens of psychological safety and responsive ways of working. Enjoy. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome, and we are joined once again today by Coach Clinton Aegis. Coach, how you doing this week?
I'm doing well, man. Things are going good. I had a good opportunity to spend some time with family over the long weekend. So, back here focused and ready to get going. How
Yeah,
about
about the
yourself?
same. Awesome. Glad to hear. Nice to have a 4-day weekend. Always enjoy that. So, yeah, back at it here this week and looking forward to another good conversation.
Absolutely,
Yeah, so we're
absolutely.
going to switch it up a little bit this time. And we've had a couple good chats already and been enjoying those. And so this week, we're going to kind of let you lead the conversation a little bit. Whereas the past couple times we talked, it was sort of me in the interviewer seat. And I enjoyed that. But you're going to pick my brain a little bit. And then, of course, it will still be a two-way conversation. And you can jump in anytime you want, but you'll be in the driver's seat.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you on this. And so, what I wanted to do, to be honest with you, Chris, is really thinking about your role as all things learning development, right? I mean, people may have insight into the fact that as someone who's a professional in that space, that you use a lot of change management practices. And so, kind of what I want to lean into today is just talking about and describing a time when change management practices helped you when you were trying to navigate a significant organizational change or anything like that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to riff on that a little bit. So, I think the first thing to understand about learning services and training, really focusing on the delivery of these things, is that training and learning services are one of the most important tools in the belt for change management. And there's a few reasons why that is. And the first one is just the fact that training delivery is built to touch a lot of people. So there's a scale thing there. Whether you're dealing with kind of on demand um, training that's delivered or learning that's delivered is sort of like e-learning or something like that. Obviously that's a really important thing to consider when you're trying to download or upskill people in large batches, right? So you can only fit
Hmm.
so many people in a live classroom. And so at some point you've got to kind of consider the digital aspect. Like if you've got 1,000 or 5,000 learners in a large organization that you're trying to deliver new skills, new knowledge to, or even practice, with labs and things like that. There's a platform aspect there, so just
Hmm.
the idea of being able to touch and deliver new skills, new learning to large cohorts of people. Most of the types of folks we deal with, you and I, they're large organizations. You're talking about head counts of 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 or more people usually. So when you're trying to drive some kind of unified change initiative, you need training as a tool because there's an ability to touch at scale there. And then if you're even not talking about on demand, because e-learning on demand has its shortcomings, right? It's not
Right.
the silver bullet at all. So sometimes you want to have an expert coach or an expert facilitator in a classroom with people, but even in that type of modality, there's an ability to impact a lot of people in a short period of time. So if you just do a little bit of napkin math, when we're delivering learning programs, you might be arranging for, maybe say 4 to 6 instructors or facilitators, and they're all delivering to class sizes of 20 people or something like that. So in one swoop, you've got 100 people coming through. And then as you do those in a series, I've been involved in a lot of learning programs where it's quite a large initiative. And so, you've got a team of facilitators like that delivering classroom training, classroom workshops, and maybe they deliver 2, 3 times a month in waves to their cohorts. So now you're training and moving people through live classrooms where they can get hands-on interaction, practice new skills, ask questions of the coach, learn how to apply what they're learning to their specific situation. And you're doing that maybe 3 to 500 people per month. And so if you're in a coaching capacity, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, because you're obviously the coach in the room, but a lot of times, although coaches also deliver training because it is an important tool, right? But you're dealing oftentimes with smaller teams. You're having one-on-one conversations, and that's really important as well. But it's not an either or thing; it's a both and thing, right? And so I
Right.
think that's the first thing, is just the ability to touch a lot of people. And the reason that you want to do that at an appropriate level of scale is because so much of what we're trying to do is establish alignment. It's not really about just running a bunch of people through a classroom and giving them a lecture or something like that. What you're really trying to do is establish this alignment, level setting everyone. And so training and learning is a really powerful way to do that, because you can level set people. A lot of times, one of the things that I always talk about with customers right off the bat is just the fact that a lot of times it's a challenge even just to get people speaking the same vocabulary, using the same terminology. Different words mean different things to different people. And so there's a way to align and lock everybody in on that when you're able to deliver unified learning solutions to a lot of people all at once. So establishing alignment, baselining on core concepts, baselining on vocabulary and nomenclature and things like that. Being able to do that with a lot of people in a fairly short period of time. In my experience, you've got to have a classroom modality or some kind of learning modality associated with that, so that you can touch a lot of people at the same time, get that alignment established, and also just set expectations, because this is all part of the content that you can deliver in the classroom. You can sort of amplify the message that's coming from a C-level leader or decision maker, something like that. They can have town halls, they can have all hands meetings and things like that, but they're usually not going to have those um, at a frequency and at enough of a repeat level, to reinforce the message over and over and over. But in a classroom, you've got them in there for a whole day, 2 whole days, 3 whole days, or what have you. And that gives you the time to really amplify and stress the message and the reasoning that's coming from the top around what you're trying to establish. So those are a few thoughts I have around that.
Yeah, yeah, no, and as I'm listening to what you're saying, right? I mean, there sounds like a lot of coordination that needs to happen, especially when you're talking about, large organizations trying to move large quantities of people, right? To take on new skills and new behaviors, right, from that learning and development activities. And so with that being said, right, how do you feel that learning development programs kind of influence that whole strategic approach towards the transformation or the change that the organization is seeking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think the first thing to understand about that is that learning and training is never an end unto itself. And I kind of alluded to this before, but learning and training is a tool for establishing some other type of outcome. So, I think that's the main thing. Is to always understand that. If you're a training customer or you're engaged in some kind of a learning program, it's not necessarily the topic or the subject matter of the learning that's first and foremost. First and foremost is that business need. What are we trying to accomplish? And how are we going to use learning and training as a tool, probably one of multiple tools that we have. Ideally, the most successful change initiatives or transformations going to be achieved from combining training and classroom deliveries, combining learning services with messaging from leaders, along with coaching as well. Because one of the big drawbacks of learning and training is that it does end. It doesn't last beyond a certain amount of time. And one of the things that you're trying to achieve with learning delivery is a behavior change generally. That can be more human factors, level of behavior, or it can be hard skills. You're just trying to teach somebody how to use a new tool or something like that. But even if it's something as cut and dried as new tool usage, learning new skills on some new piece of technology or something like that, they still have to go back to work and apply it for the things that they're trying to do. And so that is going to involve a little bit of behavior change. That really can only come from the coach, as you know, right? So you learn in the classroom, get the fundamentals, get the concepts, get walked through from an expert how to apply things and what you're trying to do, but then to apply them back on the job usually takes some practice, and it takes some sustained practice. Usually, you've got to hope that the new behaviors are going to stick, right? And so you actually don't want to hope that they'll stick. You have to ensure that they'll stick, right? And so that usually comes from having an expert there who's a little bit more in the role of a coach or something like that, who can walk them through, give them feedback, make sure that they're actually applying the stuff that they've learned in a training program in on the job, and so that they're sustaining that behavior change, sustaining the application of those new skills and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, as a coach, I know that oftentimes it is our role to help support and that new knowledge that's been acquired. Um, and but there are also a lot of times when we're not able to provide that support. And so for those who are listening out there, right? I mean, how important is change management as relates to supporting the goals of learning and development?
Yeah, it's super important, right? So, and I think change management and learning programs are something that really go hand in hand. So, learning and training can directly support the change initiative, but then that can kind of work in the other direction too, right? Because let's say you've got a large cohort of enterprise learners. 500 engineers or something like that, and they've decided, from a high level, if we implement a new tool for automating something, then we understand we can increase our efficiency by X% over time or something like that. But that is going to require integration of a new tool. It's also going to require a good usage of the new tool, and it's going to require adoption of the new tool in the first place. So, you know, there's a few things there, right? Like, number one, people aren't going to adopt if they don't know how to use the thing. So they got to be educated on how to use it. Secondly, they need to have that alignment that we talked about. So they need to understand the why, and the learning is a really good piece of that, because that's something that you can establish in a classroom or with training or something like that, is just helping people understand, why are we making this change. Why are we trying to do some new thing, and you and I've talked a little bit about that in the past, but helping people understand why. People don't like change. I think we're predisposed to stay in our comfort zone, and people have angst when they're asked to change. So just being directed to change or just being asked to without a good reason is not going to be a good way. People need to understand why, and most times people are quite receptive to that. They just need to be met where they are, and have a good explanation of why. But understanding the why, I think, is a really important piece of change management. So if we're talking about just a change management initiative, then the training and the learning is a big piece of that. The adoption is a big piece, making sure people have the skills that they need so that they can confidently adopt. And then, there's another piece, kind of from a different angle of change management, which is in our hypothetical. Let's say you're going to roll out this new automation tool, or let's say you're rolling out a new, say, AI integration feature or something like that. um, there is a change management component that's kind of outside just the training piece as well, in terms of systems integration, right? And I'm sure you've seen this. There's a lot of times there's a lot of work that has to be done just to make sure the new tool is integrated, it plays nicely with existing systems, older systems are retired, things like that. That type of work requires intensive change management as well, not just because it's going to impact how people are doing things, but there's an engineering thing there. So you don't new tools, new systems, especially at enterprise scale, they don't just get magically implemented. There's an implementation effort there, and so there's a couple different kinds of change management that we're dealing with. And so there's kind of an integration piece, and then there's an upskilling piece. There's a socialization piece, and so there's relationships there between the training and the upskilling. But also, you're kind of trying to integrate the adoption and the understanding of how to apply the new piece of technology with the training and the learning piece, even as you're also using change management for the actual integration itself. So if you have any thoughts on that, love to hear them, but that's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I align with that 100%. I mean, when I think about it, again, I often use the ADKAR framework, right? ADKAR. Um, and that K in the middle is for knowledge, right? And that knowledge is your learning and development. So, I mean, again, on the front side of that, it's, understanding that awareness, that desire, that AD, right? Making sure that people understand, to your point, why we need to change, giving them the motivation to want to change, right? And then we educate them on what the change is, what the new skills are through that knowledge. And then that ability, right, that A and that R is where coaching comes in, right? So the ability to take that knowledge and apply it, right, is going to be important. Coaches help support that. And then reinforcing that knowledge again, making sure that because again, people revert back because we do what's common and comfortable for us. And so, it's an opportunity again to kind of leverage, what your group has done from a learning and development and using that and making sure that we're reinforcing that going forward. So yeah, I think there's definitely some synergy in how we work together. And a lot of times I see organizations, however, that will bring in learning and development. You deliver training, right? You deliver courses, you deliver workshops, you educate folks. Um, but then we don't have enough time to really
Mm.
democratized knowledge, right? We don't get a chance to use it. We don't get a chance to make mistakes and things of that nature. How would you speak to that? How would you speak to an organizational leader who's pressed for time, right? Because that's what it boils down to. It boils down to press for time, right? Trying to get something accomplished, trying to get a lot accomplished in a short amount of time. How would you work with someone like that,
Yeah,
Chris?
there's a couple great call outs there. So I think the first one is just not having the time, right? So not being able to make mistakes, not being able to practice, and this really gets to something that's really close to my heart because um, training takes on a lot of different forms, and there's there's I don't know if I'd go so far as to say there's a full blown revolution happening right now in the enterprise training world, but there's certainly an awareness of a need for improvement there, and there are a lot of changes taking place. But if you think about, say, IT training or on the job skills training 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it really was kind of the dreaded death by PowerPoint a lot of times. It's not to say that the
Hmm.
subject matter expert didn't know their stuff or the content wasn't good or something like that. But, you're taking people out of their jobs for a couple of days, sitting them in a classroom so that they can consume a 200 slide deck of something, and listen to a subject matter expert lecture about something, and there's a lot of theory, a lot of PowerPoint, not a lot of practice, not a lot of engagement, certainly not a whole lot of opportunity to play with things and make mistakes, which is really where the real learning happens, I should say, right? Like, I saw
Hmm.
a pretty cool graphic on LinkedIn this morning where it was kind of a little representation, like a bar chart of where the learning comes from. And it was kind of like, book study, training, and then making mistakes in that order. And making mistakes is really 80% of the learning. So what we want to do, if we're looking at training or learning as a product, we want that product to be the best experience for the people who are learning, and that is not going to be death by PowerPoint or sitting in a classroom, listening to a lecture. You need a little bit of PowerPoint, you need a little bit of lecture, but what you really want to do is create experiences where they can practice in a safe space. And that's another real value add of the training modality, is that you can create simulated environments. You can configure labs and things like that so that people can play in a safe sandbox that they may not have. They're not making mistakes in production, right? Because that's, from a cost benefit standpoint, making mistakes are valuable, but it may not be worth the learning that you're going to have if you break something in production. So you have to try to create these environments where people can kind of start to do some of those things. They get hands on and they can make mistakes under the supervision of an expert, get feedback on those things, and kind of get some of the benefit of the learning that comes from trying and failing a little bit within a safe classroom environment. And as you can imagine, that's a totally different type of learning experience. That's not a
Yeah.
one-sided lecture delivery, going through slides. That's basically, maybe using a couple of slides and the facilitator setting the stage, but you want to get them working on the thing quickly. And then there's also, just kind of from a brain science standpoint, I think it's worth mentioning that engagement is a big thing. So if it's a technical tool, you might be talking about a lab, participating, doing work, getting hands on like that. But training and learning is not always a technical tool. Sometimes it's more of the soft skills that you and I've been talking about. Sometimes it's designed to build alignment or something like that. So, how do you create the space for people to, quote unquote, practice and make mistakes in that type of a situation as well? Well, you can kind of do the same thing. So there's a pedagogical aspect there in which the classroom experience is designed to really get people talking, get people participating, get them sharing their own thoughts, working in small groups. Thinking about, all right, how might this really work? It's different than a technical tool enablement in which they really just need to get the instructions and then get in the lab and start practicing the thing. But one way or the other, whether it's lab-based practice for a tool or whether it's something a little bit more abstract, you're still trying to get to that level of engagement very quickly. So it should be like a two-way, a participatory experience. Because one way or the other, it's that participation that's gonna lead to the learning. So I think I answered the question. I'm not sure. Tell me if I did.
Yeah, no, 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 no. You answered it. You answered it just fine. And when I'm listening to you, right, I'm thinking about. I mean, I guess those are techniques that you're
Mm-hmm.
mentioning, right? I know I'm familiar with takes like
Mm-hmm.
gamification, teaching from the instructing from the back
Yes.
of the room, vertical facilitation. I mean, some of those things like that, right? Are those any terms that you can kind of double click on for us, or anything you can kind of share about some of those
Yeah,
techniques a little
yeah,
bit more?
happy to. So, I'll choose a couple, right? So, I'll start with. So you mentioned one of them actually, TBR, or training from the back of the room, an important trend in learning and development right now. So it's interesting. We are actually going to be recording a conversation with one of the masters of TBR after our episode. So one of the next conversations we're going to have is he's with a really globally respected leader in this space, Shane Hasty. He works now for SoftEd, but we're going to do an episode entirely focused on TBR. And so there's a saying that Shane has shared with me in our conversations, and we'll talk about this in depth. But there's a little quip that he says that TBR is really about turning the trainer or the facilitator from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And I really like that, right? Like that really kind of sums it up. And there's a whole catalog of techniques that are sort of designed there to create that type of participatory engagement in the classroom and get the facilitator, get the expert, someone who's still there, still accessible, still a teacher, but it's not a one-sided delivery of teaching. You're now teaching by getting people to engage and getting them to participate and learn by doing, really, because learning by doing is way more effective than like consuming one-sided lecture or something like that. You also mentioned gamification, which I think is a really interesting thing. Now, gamification is one of those kind of love it or hate it words in the learning world because it's something people talk about a lot, but frankly, you rarely see it done well. It's one of those things kind of everybody wants to do and everybody says they're doing it and things like that, but are they really doing it effectively? Not sure. Um, but the reality is it can be it's definitely a legitimate technique, but it takes some intentional design to do that. So when you think about gamification is really all about leveraging incentive behavior, and the tech companies are really good at this when they design app engagement, things like that. They've got the best psychosocial researchers working for them. They've got psychologists and people like that who understand kind of what the reward mechanisms are in the brain, and how can we keep people on our platform and keep them from closing our app. And they pull out every trick in the book that they can use to kind of activate those reward mechanisms. But without making it sound like something sinister, it's that same type of consideration of reward mechanisms and incentives that we want to leverage to their benefit when we're trying to gamify a learning experience. So, a few things about that specifically would be that obviously you want to set it up so that people are able to achieve rewards. You also want to make it fun because the word game is right there in the name. But there's a couple interesting things like that. So one of the things that you find when you look into the way these reward mechanisms work in the brain is that the reward circuits are activated more powerfully when there's a little bit of unpredictability there. So, you're not necessarily just serving them up a task and then there's a reward there every time. It stimulates the reward centers if you suddenly manifest a reward out of the blue, whether they've done the thing to receive the reward or not. Also, if they do something successfully and then kind of every 4 or 5 times randomly they get a bigger reward that they weren't expecting. So that really fires off those reward mechanisms. If they're the brain learns those types of things and becomes habituated to it really quickly. So you want to like bake some unpredictability into that type of thing. So
Mm.
those are a few thoughts around that. The other thing, there's a technology aspect here that I've got a bias about this just because I've been doing a lot of work on this currently in a project. But we had an interesting conversation. This was the last ELA podcast episode that just dropped. We spoke with Rich Levy, who I mentioned, who before we started our recording today. But Rich and I talked about AR and VR to build learning and training experiences. And it's interesting because one of the things that you can do using that type of technology is it actually does several things that we're sort of talking about here, but it really amps them up. And one of them is this idea of creating an immersive experience. So obviously, something like VR, AR, XR, you have the potential to create a way more immersive situation there. But if we think about gamification, you also have the potential to create a really exciting gamified environment in a safe space, just like we're talking about in a normal classroom. You're trying to create like a lab,
Hmm.
an opportunity to break things, and there's no real consequence, so you can kind of learn what you did wrong or whatever. Well, when you're in a completely immersive environment, it really is the right platform for that kind of thing. Because if you imagine, let's say you have a job in which you're dealing with let's say a safety systems or something like that, and it's quite a technical engineering environment. So let's say, for instance, a power plant or a nuclear plant or something like that. You've got all these technical systems. There's got to be training on those things. And how do you create an immersive environment where people can make mistakes in a way that's safe when you have this type of mission critical environment? So using technology to create an immersive environment can achieve that, but it's also the perfect modality to gamify it because you're already
Hmm.
wearing a headset, or you're already, even if it doesn't have to be a headset, even it could just be on a computer or something like that. But you've got a replicated simulated environment that ordinarily could be quite dangerous. And now you're really tuning into people's risk and reward mechanisms, because if they do the wrong thing, you can just absolutely blow it up, literally cause an explosion or something like that, just like you would if you were playing a video game. It's very stimulating, and it's like, oh, whoa, I just lost my life, but it's safe. but it's also exciting, and that's fun. And then on the reward tip as well, you have a really robust capability to kind of wrap the gamification around stuff like that. So I mention it only just because I'm involved in a project right now in which we're doing some of that kind of thing, and then I just spoke with Rich about it the other
Mm,
day. But you can see the relationships here, and you can take the AR XR thing completely out of the conversation. Just consider it a normal conventional classroom, but there's still principles like that you can begin to apply to make things immersive, to design things to the reward mechanisms in the brain, to drive participation, to learn by making mistakes, and all these things, no matter what the type of training platform is. So those are a few specific things I guess I would talk about in response to what you asked.
yeah. No, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that, and I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit. So, if we think about audiences, right? So we've kind of talked about, what we need to do to roll out, new skills, new behaviors, and things of that nature. One of the toughest audiences that we have as consultants coming into the organization is going to be the executive leadership team, right? Um, what kind of patterns would you recommend from a learning and development standpoint for supporting those executives and getting them right? I mean, you talk about time and availability, right? I mean, you're really pressed, and so what kind of a recommendation would you have for getting that audience and being successful in helping them establish new behaviors?
Yeah, for sure. So, rule number one, when you are dealing with a C audience or executives, it really is about that time thing, right? So, you will never put C's through a 2-day workshop of any kind, right? The rule of thumb that we've usually used is the maximum amount of time in a learning experience that someone of that seniority is going to be going through. It's going to be like about 4 hours, probably. So you can get them out of there. And then the other thing is that you're really very rarely going to use that. I mean, to the degree we've already established that one-sided lecture is not the best anyway. But whereas you would try to minimize that, but maybe still need a little bit of it with a general practitioner audience, you'll have basically none of that in a C-level workshop, right? So the other thing I would say is I almost always try to use the word workshop with that type of audience because it's really not even a class at that point. The education is going to come from something that's very participatory, and the facilitator, they're certainly not going to be the sage on the stage. They may not even be the guide on the side. They may just be a facilitator. That the whole goal of a workshop like that, it may not really be to deliver some kind of new knowledge or skills. The work product that you want as a result of that may just be alignment. And so the facilitator's job in a situation like that is to get the executives who are in that room all on the same page. And they've got to have presence as well, right? Like the facilitator has to be someone who has a lot of experience in dealing with those senior audience, and they've got to move quickly. They've got to be able to cut right to the important thing very fast, so that they don't lose the attention and the respect of the leadership audience. But yeah, those are just a few things, right? But you've got to be very well prepared in a completely different way because you have to understand what are the business drivers that those execs are looking to get out of that workshop, and how are you gonna leave them equipped with alignment together, but also expectations. And there's room there as well when you have them in the room to help them empathize and understand what are the needs of your people beneath you, and what should your expectations be there. So it's a different kind of education, I guess I would say, because C's a lot of times they're siloed off in their ivory towers, and even if they are trying to be highly engaged, they may have only minimal interaction with people who are on the front lines, practitioner level, IC level, things like that. And it's just a completely different world, and it can be really easy to lose touch, with what the work looks like. And so, but you can't just go in there and explain to them what the work looks like for an individual contributor, right? You have to build the tie between how the work of all the teams out there is rolling up to the overarching initiative that they are there to sponsor. So I think that's the other thing I would say about an executive audience is the facilitator has to be prepared to really kind of like decompose in both directions how the strategic decisions, the investment decisions, why is this going to save me money, why is this going to give me competitive advantage, you have to answer those questions and decompose how the initiative rolls out all the way down to the teams that are going to be doing the work. So it's a different kind of story. It's a different kind of training experience. Like, I almost hesitate to even call it training at that point. It's really more of a workshopping exercise, and the work products there are really shared alignment, expectation alignment, and then sometimes just extracting what you need from the executive audience, right? So it becomes the opposite of a one-sided delivery from a trainer. It becomes the trainer actually getting what they need to fuel the rest of what's going on with the initiative or the change management or whatever. So that's my thought around that. It's definitely a different type of audience for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree with everything that you said. And there has been a time or two that I've seen where the executives maybe did need to gain some actual skills, right? They actually maybe needed to shore up some of their change management mindset practices and things of that nature. Would you modify the approach any if you knew you had to walk away with something tangible from that group?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would, depending on what the context was. But I would want to make sure that, just like you would if you're a good meeting facilitator or something like that, you're establishing clarity around what the goal is right away, and also then very quickly explaining the why, just as you would for any training audience or learning audience. But yeah, I think you get in there in the first 5 minutes. It needs to be very clearly communicated. We are here to achieve X. Here's how we're going to do it. What are y'all's expectations for what we're here to do? And then just making the tie to justify, so they know it's not just some kind of exercise that they're there to do, but you're actually there to kind of help them, and to get them to help them help you, and get what you need out of it. But I think, as you and I have talked about before, all this really comes down to communication and clarity. And so, there's homework there as well, right? Like, so if you talk about modifying what we're going to walk in with, the homework is to already have as much kind of empathy for the leader's position and role as you can, and have an understanding of what it is that is important to them. They're the decision makers. So what are the decisions they're there to make? Why are they making them? What's important to them? And then how can you use alignment and matriculation of those decisions down through the teams? But yeah, I mean, I would definitely, you want to be very well prepared for an audience like that, and you already want to have studied up pretty hard, I think, on kind of what are the initiatives, where do things stand now, what's broken, why is it broken, stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I also like to have that point of contact, right? So typically we'll have someone, relatively high up in the organization. That's the point of contact that we're engaging and interacting with as relates to the change or the transformation we're helping support. And so getting insight from that person, hey, who's in the room? Who are the personalities in the room? What are some of the things that are important to them? Right? Messaging, right? Making sure that the words that I use are the words that make sense to this group, right? We don't come in and start speaking, because we can do that, right? As practitioners, we can come in and speak our language and completely not communicate with our audience. So, I mean, making sure that we understand those types of things, I feel like has been
Yeah, yeah,
helpful for me in
agree.
the
And
past.
I think it's important too. And I should have made this more clear before, but when you're talking about training or facilitating some kind of a learning experience, it's not a one size fits all thing, as we're talking about with the C level. But in terms of what you're I think it's important to take a moment to define that there's a few different things that you may be working with training as a common modality. So the first one is knowledge, right? Like, training and learning services is just good for disseminating knowledge, socializing knowledge. Knowledge is important, right? So people need the right knowledge to do their job. But knowledge is only one piece of it. And then, we would go to a second bucket of outcome, which is skills. And knowledge and skills are two completely different things. You need knowledge in order to have the right skills, but when you're talking about skills, that really is usually a more priority focus for us when we're going in to train teams, because that's the how. How are you doing something? And then some other ones on the long tail would just be like alignment or shared expectations. That's using the modality just to generate socialization, because we can address those larger populations of people. So those are three completely different things, right? And then the fourth one would be more in the executive scenario that we were just discussing, in which what you're really trying to do in that case is, there's an alignment piece to that, I think, but you're also trying to facilitate an initiative forward. You're actively engaging in change management, and that's a bit more abstract. It's a little bit more of a soft type delivery. But in the executive situation that we're talking about, that's a completely different thing than like skills. Although, as an aside, I did want to go back to your point that you mentioned that sometimes they do need new skills, right? Yeah, I think we've all seen people in leadership positions who probably could do a little better with empathy, or could do a little bit better with communication. There's people in management positions who need to build what they call soft skills, another term that, I have a love-hate relationship with that term. But when you're talking about things like negotiation and conflict resolution and things like that, that's a whole different type of skills than like an engineering set of skills or tool skills. And now those types of skills, I think, probably sometimes C's could benefit from upskilling on those things, but they have to want it, right? Like you're not going to force that on somebody.
No, no, you're not. So I mean, as we look at this, and I appreciate the conversation, man. I've really been enjoying this. I mean, talking about all of the learning and development. I mean, what are some good ways to measure the effectiveness of learning and development outcomes, right? How do people know that it's
Man,
been
that is a
done?
great question. One of the most important questions, I'd say, right? Because as we talked about at the top, learning is not the end unto itself. You're there to use learning as a tool to get something done. So I think just clearly communicating that that's the purpose in the first place, and then secondly saying, okay, well, if we want to get something done, we have to approach that like a SMART goal, right? It has to be specific, measurable, actionable. It can't just be abstract floating out in the ether somewhere. So I think that's a second thing that people have to be communicated about. We are here to accomplish something. We're going to frame that as a SMART goal, so it's got to be measurable, and so making that very clear. And then thirdly, from there, communicating to the audience that you're there to enable, what are we going to be measured on? And that gets to your question, right? So there's two separate sets of metrics here. And it's really important to be transparent about those metrics. So there's metrics and measurement, KPIs or what have you, around the change management initiative or whatever the initiative is that you're there to support with the training. And then there's KPIs and measurements around the training and the learning itself, which is, I think, what you're mostly asking about. So if I'm gonna talk about that
Hmm.
for a second, there's a few that I would just highlight. Some of them are kind of basic, and then some of them may be things that our audience hasn't thought as much about. But the first and foremost, I think the gold standard for me, at least in my background, and now I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but in my experience, the KPI that I always start with is the firsthand evaluation feedback from the learner themselves. Did they think the training was worth their time? Did they feel like there's a lot of questions we ask around this consistently in evals. Will you be able to apply what you learned in your job? Was it a good use of time? Did was the training time spent in the classroom used effectively? Was it a waste of your time, or was that time worthwhile? Things like that. And then the other thing that you can do, and this is obviously anybody who's in an L&D role who's listening will be familiar with this. There's a lot of metrics that can be gained from like the design and administration of assessments. So assessing people pre and post, that's a common one that is done. One of the things we're also always looking for from a metrics perspective in the learning world is retention. So that's one way as well. You can measure it. You can assess people before the training gets delivered. Then you can measure them immediately after. And then you can go back and assess them later too, a month or 6 months down the road to see was what they learned retained. So retention metrics are a big one. Just getting the firsthand metrics from the learner in terms of their feedback on the experience of the training, which, as I said, that's the gold standard to me because generally employees are, in my opinion, they're the best judge of how to get the job done, right? And I think that's probably a philosophy you'd be aligned with, right, Coach? Like nobody knows the work better than
Yep.
the person doing the work. So we always want to keep that
Absolutely.
prioritized. Yeah, and then of course there's a whole host of a domain specific measurement that may vary depending on what the learning or the subject matter is that you're dealing with there. So at that point, we would work with subject matter experts, and they would help us design what are the domain specific things that we're looking to measure. And then the final piece I would just say is that 99% of the time with what we're doing, you're there to support the business somehow. Or if it's maybe if it's a public agency or a government client or something like that, I usually will swap out profit motive for the mission. I find usually in these public sector agencies, the employees usually care about the mission just as much as, or even more sometimes, than commercial clients care about the profit motive. But so whether it's a mission in that situation or whether it's the business case for a commercial client, always trying to help, create and design metrics that somehow create the measurement of alignment between what the business case is. So I think those are the main ones that I think about.
Yeah, no, no, that's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, as I'm listening to that, right, I'm thinking about, short-term and long-term goals, right? Because I know I've been in environments where, we've got, we know we need to do something now, and then there's something we need to have change for the long haul. So how do you balance that need for immediate change actions with those long-term
Yeah.
learning
Oh
and
man, that
development
that is a
goals?
good question. I think there's a spectrum associated with it. So obviously there's spectrum of short term and long term, and there's a bunch of relationships that it's important to understand depending on where you fall on that spectrum. So short term are things that are faster, right? Like, so what can you teach? We always say, usually, especially in a commercial sense, when we're trying to sell training as a product, you know, as soon as this class is over, you're going to go back to work ready to do X, Y, Z right away. That's a selling point template that we use a lot. But that's not necessarily going to serve the overarching initiative alignment as well, and nor may
Hmm.
they care. Like a lot of times, practitioners, which again, there's an aspect here where we kind of want to understand our audience some, but which I guess is I'm hear myself say that's another one of those relationships is kind of is it the audience, right? So like if you're talking about um, let's say you're talking about a system administrator who has an SLA and they're responsible for keeping 99.99 or Six Sigma uptime in an IT operational environment or something like that. They just need to and want to understand, how do I keep my infrastructure up and running? I don't want something to break. That's in some ways the most urgent short-term thing that you could ask for, because they're not even trying to get something new done in the short term. They're just trying to prevent risk, right? So that's a little bit more short term. But then what if you're that person's manager, or what if you're the IT director over that person? They're probably spending more time thinking about the midterm. We've got a bunch of legacy stuff that we need to refactor. We know that's going to be a big project. How can we design that initiative? That's going to take 6 months or something like that. So from a learning standpoint, it's like, okay, well, what can we use learning and training for in a way that supports that 6 month goal? That's a lot different than saying you're going to know how to do XYZ right away as soon as class ends, so you can go back to work and save time, or do whatever thing. And then in a different situation, let's imagine that you're talking to like a PMO director or something like that, and they have responsibility for um, weaving together and understanding the value streams across lots of different projects and a whole bunch of product portfolios or something like that. The time horizon for something like that might be even multiple years, and that's a whole different type of content. So while there may be things that an audience like that could implement immediately, you're probably going to be trying to enable them on more strategic framework type stuff, stuff that they can understand how to steer the ship so that they're successfully achieving more value over 2-3 year time frames or something like that. So um, I hope that makes sense, but I think that that spectrum in the relationship between time horizon and then the relationship between the audiences, and what are those audiences' goals? Are they short term or long term? Things like that, and in each one of these scenarios, it's a really different kind of content. I mean, there's immediate skills that you can deliver on a tool. uh, we've been doing a lot of AI training lately for project managers. That's been a big, spending a lot of time doing that type of training. That's an example of the very short term. They're gonna save hours the very next week they go back to work with what they learn how to use the AI tool for. But if we're talking about AI with a CTO or something like that, it's a different conversation. They're trying to think about what are the
Mm.
strategic disruptions that AI is going to have on my company, and are there new segments that I need to figure out how to get into, or something like that. So now that's a tough question, Coach. I hope I did a decent job on that one.
No, no, you did, man. You did. And as I look at the time, we are winding down. So I do have one last question I wanted to ask you, and that is, what advice would you give other executives about leveraging change management practices as well as learning and development to support their
Yeah,
organizational
great question.
strategy?
I don't want to be flip, but I guess the first thing I'd say is they should go back and listen to the other conversations that we had on the pod, because we really dig into that quite a bit. But I think
Uh-huh.
I'm going to channel you for this one. I think because I think for one thing, you were way better at communicating this than I feel like I'm even equipped to be. But from a change management perspective with leadership, making sure that there's some empowerment of people who own the change management, and just making sure that there is a role there that's dedicated to it as well. You shared a story in one of our previous conversations where the initiative was coupled up to a formal change management team, and then they were let go like very shortly thereafter. That's kind of the anti-pattern, I guess. And then we talk to change managers all the time who encounter frustration because they understand what they're there to do in word, but indeed they don't have what they need. They either don't have the authority or they don't have the buy-in from the people who do have the authority, things like that. So I think just understanding those dynamics, and then understanding some of the dynamics which are like well broken down by things like the ADKAR framework, some of these other change management frameworks. And a lot of it is just kind of psychological, and then I think if they understand and empathize with the drivers and the psychological factors of the people who are doing this work, and understand, why do they need some of the other stuff you and I've talked about, right? Like, why is psychological safety important? How does that relate to incentive? And how does incentive relate to them getting the thing done successfully that they're looking to get done? I think understanding that, that's something that learning can help a lot with, and there's training that can help a lot with that. Yeah, so I mean, those are a few thoughts, I guess, but I think take it seriously. Come back to another Clinton concept that you've talked about quite a bit: communication, right? That's one of the most powerful things
Yeah.
that a leader can do is communicate early and often. Make sure the message is clear, make sure it makes sense to people, and that they understand the why. I think that's the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things, is that if you expect people to get on board, getting people on board is sort of primary responsibility of somebody who's in change management, and people aren't going to get on board unless they understand the why, and it's the leader's responsibility to communicate and help people understand why. So from an executive standpoint, I think making sure that they have a crisp story to tell and they understand their audience, and that they are prepared and they can communicate and tell that story, communicate the why, and then once they've got that, do it a bunch of times, right, over and over.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and what I like to say, it comes from Peter Drucker, right? That the advice that I would have for executives is that culture
Mm-hmm.
eats strategy for breakfast. And what exactly does that mean? It means no matter how great your business strategy is, your plan will fail without a company culture that encourages people to implement it. And so that culture is driven from the things that you just got finished talking about, having a clear vision, communicating that, and getting people to
Absolutely.
buy into it. Awesome. Well, thanks, man, Chris. I've enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to the
Yeah,
next time when
man,
we
me
can get
too. This is
together
great. Appreciate
again.
you coming back and doing this. I'm really enjoying it myself, and it was cool to have you in the driver's seat today. I like that. So thanks for being willing to do that. And yeah, we'll talk to you next time. Yeah, man.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right, bye.
All right. Bye.